I gave him life twice. Once when he was born and once when I gave him my kidney. And this is how he repaid me, by stealing everything I had. But what he couldn't steal was my strength. Stay with me to hear how I rose after the deepest betrayal. My dear, your feedback means so much to me. Please let me know where you're watching from and whether you enjoyed this story. It's truly, truly important to me. Thank you so much. I gave him life twice. The first time when I brought him into this world after long hours of pain, holding his tiny body against mine, believing with every breath that he was my greatest blessing. The second time when I lay on a hospital bed, weaker than I'd ever been, watching the nurses wheel him out of surgery with my kidney inside him, praying that this gift would give him the future I'd always dreamed he would have. And this is how he repaid me, by robbing me blind, by stripping me of what little I had left, by leaving me with nothing but an empty house and a heart shattered beyond recognition. My name is Vivian. I am 70 years old, a mother, a widow, a woman who once believed that love could fix anything. That sacrifice, given freely, would always be met with gratitude. I see now how wrong I was. It began after the transplant. At first, Samuel seemed full of thanks. His eyes welled with tears the day he came to my hospital room, holding my hand so tight I thought he'd never let go. "Mama," he whispered, "I owe you my life." But as the weeks turned into months, that gratitude faded. The calls became fewer, the visits shorter, and then came the requests. Small at first, a little help with rent, a loan until his next paycheck. I gave willingly. How could I not? He was my son, my child, the boy I had nearly died to save. But the requests became demands. The soft voice turned sharp. The promises to repay me vanished like smoke, and one day I came home to find the house ransacked, my savings gone, my jewelry missing, the few heirlooms I had left from my mother and her mother before her nowhere to be found. I knew without needing proof. Samuel had done this. My boy, my baby, had stolen from me after I'd given him everything. I sank to the floor that day, the weight of it all pressing down so hard I thought it would crush me. And in that moment, I realized I had lost not just my things, but the son I thought I knew. For days, I didn't leave the house. I sat in the quiet, listening to the echoes of the life I'd built here. The creak of the stairs where Samuel used to sit as a boy, the soft whistle of the wind through the crack in the window he'd always promised to fix. Every sound reminded me of him, of the child I had raised, the man I thought I'd known. I replayed it all in my mind, the nights I'd stayed up rocking him through his fevers, the school plays I'd never missed, the meals I'd gone without so he could have enough. And then the day the doctors told me he needed a transplant or he wouldn't see another year, there had been no question in my mind. My body might have been tired, but my heart was strong, and I would give whatever part of myself he needed to live. And live he did. But somewhere between that hospital bed and this empty house, something in him had changed. Or maybe, I thought bitterly, it had always been there, and I had been too blind with love to see it. Tasha, my neighbor and dear friend, was the first to knock on my door after the robbery. She found me sitting in the dark, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes dry because I had no tears left to give. "Oh, Vivian," she said, kneeling beside me, her voice full of sorrow. "Why didn't you call me?" What could I say? That I was too ashamed, that I couldn't bear for anyone to see what my own flesh and blood had done? But Tasha stayed. She made tea. She opened the curtains. She sat with me as the sun set and the stars came out, reminding me with her quiet presence that I was not as alone as I felt. And that night, for the first time since Samuel had taken everything, I felt a flicker of something other than pain. A spark of resolve. I had survived the loss of my husband, the hardships of raising a son alone, the trials of illness. I would survive this too. Because if there was one thing I knew after 70 years in this world, it was this. A mother's love can break you, but it can also make you stronger than you ever believed possible. The next morning, I woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through my curtains. The house still felt empty, but I felt different. The weight on my chest hadn't vanished, but I could breathe a little easier. I dressed slowly, my hands trembling just a bit, and made myself breakfast for the first time in days. Just toast and tea, but enough to remind myself that I could still care for me. Tasha came by again, bringing groceries I hadn't asked for, but so deeply needed. She sat with me, and we talked. At first, of small things, the weather, the garden, the neighborhood. But then the conversation turned gently to Samuel. "You know it wasn't your fault, Vivian," she said, her eyes kind but steady. "You gave him all you had. What he chose to do, that's on him." Her words stung. Not because they weren't true, but because I had clung for so long to the belief that if I just loved him enough, gave enough, sacrificed enough, I could protect him from the worst parts of himself. But Tasha was right. I could not shield him from choices he was determined to make. That afternoon, I began to clean the house. Room by room, I put things back in order. Not because I thought I could erase what had happened, but because I needed to reclaim this space, my home, my refuge. With every drawer I straightened, every shelf I dusted, I felt a little stronger, and when I came to the empty jewelry box, the place where my mother's wedding ring had once rested, I didn't cry. Instead, I whispered a promise. "You took what you could, Samuel, but you didn't take me. I'm still here, and I will rise." I didn't know how yet. I didn't know where the path would lead. But I knew this. I would not let his betrayal be the end of my story. The days that followed were filled with small acts of reclaiming my life. I went through the house, not to mourn what was missing, but to remind myself of what remained. The quilt I had stitched by hand during long nights when Samuel was a baby, the photo albums filled with smiles that, though painful to look at now, told the truth of the love I had given. The books I had read to him, their pages worn soft from little hands turning them over and over. Each item I touched was a thread connecting me to the woman I had been, the woman I still was beneath the grief. Tasha helped me contact the authorities. I filed the report, though I knew in my heart that Samuel would be hard to find. He was clever, and desperate men don't leave easy trails, but the act of standing up, of saying this was wrong, it mattered. It reminded me that I still had a voice. Neighbors began to stop by, offering casseroles, flowers from their gardens, small tokens of support, and with each kindness I felt the walls of my isolation crack and crumble. I realized I'd been so focused on Samuel, on saving him, that I'd forgotten there were other hands willing to hold mine if I would only reach out. I began to walk again, just to the end of the block and back at first. The sun on my face, the breeze in my hair, the sound of children playing. All of it reminded me that the world was still turning and I was still part of it. And each evening, as the sky faded from gold to indigo, I sat on my porch and breathed in the quiet promise of the night. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew this. I was still here, and I would not let what had been stolen define what I had left to build. The hardest part wasn't losing what Samuel took. It was learning how to live without the weight of him on my mind, learning to let go of the questions that had haunted me in the quiet hours. Where did I go wrong? Why wasn't my love enough? But as the days turned to weeks, I found that the more I focused on what I could do, what I could build, the less space those questions took up in my heart. Tasha encouraged me to come to the community center. At first, I resisted. What could I offer? What could I say that anyone would want to hear? But she persisted, and one cool autumn morning I went. The room was filled with faces like mine, women and men who had known loss, who carried invisible scars. I listened more than I spoke at first, soaking in their stories. And slowly I began to share mine. Not the part about being robbed, not at first, but about the garden I had tended when Samuel was small, about the strength it took to build a life alone, about the small joys I was learning to see again. And in their nods, In their soft words of encouragement, I found a reflection of the strength I'd forgotten I had. I began helping at the center, small tasks at first, sweeping floors, folding donated clothes, tending a tiny patch of earth behind the building. And with each act, I felt my spirit mend a little more. Samuel's shadow didn't vanish, but it no longer blocked out the sun. The garden behind the community center became my sanctuary. At first, it was just a patch of neglected soil, choked with weeds and littered with stones. But as my hands worked the earth, pulling up the roots of neglect, turning the soil, planting seeds, I felt as if I were doing the same within myself. Children from the neighborhood would gather around, curious about what I was doing. I showed them how to plant beans along the fence, how to sprinkle marigold seeds to keep pests away. Their laughter filled the air, their eager hands reminding me of Samuel when he was small, before the shadows grew between us. Tasha joined me often, bringing tea, her presence steady and comforting. Together we planned a small herb garden, a row of sunflowers to brighten the space. The neighbors took notice. Soon, others began to help. What started as a solitary effort became a shared act of hope. One afternoon, as I wiped sweat from my brow and surveyed the new green shoots pushing through the soil, I realized something. I no longer thought of the house Samuel had emptied of valuables as a place of loss. I thought of the garden we were building as a place of beginning. At the center, I was asked to share my story. This time I told the truth, not all at once, but enough to let others see the path I had walked. I spoke of the sacrifice I made to save Samuel's life, of the betrayal that followed, of the grief that had nearly swallowed me, and I spoke of this, that healing didn't come in grand moments or easy answers. It came in the small acts of tending, soil, community, self. As I spoke, I saw heads nodding, tears glistening, hands reaching out in quiet solidarity, and I knew I was no longer just surviving, I was growing. Each day in the garden became a kind of prayer, not one spoken aloud, but one offered through my hands, in the soil, through the quiet care I gave to each plant, each growing thing. The garden taught me patience again. It reminded me that beauty comes slowly, that roots must take hold before anything can bloom. The children who helped me began calling it Miss Vivian's garden, though I always told them it belonged to all of us. I watched as their small hands learned to care for something fragile, as their faces lit up when the first green shoots broke through the earth, and in their joy I felt my own heart lift. Tasha and I often sat together at the end of the day, watching the sun dip low and paint the world in gold. We talked about small things, recipes, books, plans for more garden beds. But sometimes, in the quiet between our words, I felt the heaviness in my chest ease. One evening, as we packed up our tools, Tasha touched my arm gently. "Vivian," she said, "I hope you see what we all see. You've built something beautiful. And not just in this garden." I thought about that as I walked home, the evening air cool and sweet around me. My house still felt empty in places, reminders of what Samuel had taken, but the emptiness no longer defined it. The home I was building now wasn't made of things. It was made of the connections I was tending, the hope I was choosing each day. And as I stood on my porch beneath the stars, I realized that I had taken the first true steps toward reclaiming my life. The garden behind the community center flourished, and so did I. What had started as a patch of soil became a tapestry of color and life. Rows of lettuce and tomatoes, bright bursts of zinnias and sunflowers, fragrant herbs lining the paths. It drew people in not just for the harvest, but for the peace it offered. The quiet reminder that something beautiful could grow where there had once been neglect. Children came to help after school, their laughter filling the air. Seniors from the neighborhood sat on benches nearby sharing stories, offering advice on which plants grew best where. The garden had become a heartbeat in the community, and in its rhythm, I found my own strength returning. I worked alongside Tasha most days, our friendship deepening like well-tended roots. She brought seeds, tools, sometimes just her steady presence. We spoke of dreams, hers of opening a small cafe filled with warmth and good food, mine of expanding the garden, of teaching others what it had taught me, that hope could be planted and grown, even in the hardest soil. The community center invited me to lead a small class, gardening for the soul, they called it. I hesitated, but Tasha urged me on. And so, with trembling hands but a heart growing steadier by the day, I shared what I had learned, that tending to the earth could heal wounds deeper than the skin, that watching something grow could mend even the most broken of spirits. And as I stood before that small group, I saw reflected in their faces what I had almost forgotten, that strength can bloom after sorrow, that even after great loss, we can choose to begin again. And still, there were nights when Samuel's absence echoed through the quiet, when I stood in my house and felt the hollow where his love should have been. But the difference was I no longer let that hollow define me. I had learned to fill it with purpose, with kindness given and received, with new beginnings. The community center invited me to lead a small class, gardening for the soul, they called it. I hesitated, but Tasha urged me on, and so, with trembling hands but a heart growing steadier by the day, I shared what I had learned, that tending to the earth could heal wounds deeper than the skin, that watching something grow could mend even the most broken of spirits. And as I stood before that small group, I saw reflected in their faces what I had almost forgotten, that strength can bloom after sorrow, that even after great loss, we can choose to begin again. The class became more than just a lesson in planting seeds or turning soil. It became a space where people shared their heartaches, their hopes, their quiet victories. Women spoke of lost children, of broken marriages, of dreams deferred. Men spoke of jobs gone, of friends buried, of years they thought wasted. And together, as we worked with the earth, we began to understand that no loss is the end unless we let it be. The garden became our shared testament, with every weed pulled, every row planted, every bloom that opened beneath the sun. We reminded ourselves that we were still here, that life went on, not in spite of the pain we carried, but alongside it. One afternoon, as I knelt to tie up tomato vines heavy with fruit, I looked up to see Tasha watching me with a smile. "You know, Vivian," she said, "I think you've done more for this community than you'll ever realize." I shook my head, brushing dirt from my hands. "No, Tasha, we did it together." And it was true. The garden had grown because of all of us, because of the hands that had worked the soil, the hearts that had chosen to hope again. There were still nights when I sat on my porch and thought of Samuel. I wondered where he was, whether he ever thought of me, whether he felt the weight of what he'd done. But those thoughts no longer hollowed me out. Instead, they reminded me of how far I had come. I no longer waited for an apology that might never come. I no longer needed it to know my worth. The garden was my proof that from what is broken, something beautiful can rise. Spring returned, and with it came new life. Not just in the garden, but in me. The air smelled of rain and earth, and everywhere I looked there was color. Soft pinks of blossoming trees, the brilliant gold of daffodils, the deep green of fresh leaves. The garden thrived, a living testament to the work of many hands, to the healing that could be found in tending something beyond ourselves. I found myself smiling more, laughing with the children as they chased butterflies between the rows of vegetables, sharing stories with the elders who came to rest on the benches we had built. The garden wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to everyone. And in that, I felt richer than I had in years. The community center asked me to help lead a larger project, turning another abandoned lot into a shared garden and teaching space. I hesitated at first. Could I really give more? But as I stood among the blooms we'd already grown, I realized I wanted to. Because each seed planted, each hand that joined in the work, each small victory reminded me that purpose can be found again no matter how much has been lost. Tasha was my steady companion. Together, we mapped out the new garden beds, chose plants, organized volunteers. Our friendship had become one of the great gifts of this new chapter, proof that family isn't only who we're born to, but who chooses to stand beside us when the storms come. And through it all, I carried Samuel in my heart, not as the boy who betrayed me, but as the son I had loved. I prayed for him, not with bitterness, but with hope that somewhere he too might be planting new seeds, finding his way back to the light. The new garden took shape slowly, but with each passing week, the empty lot transformed. What had once been a patch of broken glass and weeds became neat rows of raised beds, trellises waiting for vines to climb, paths lined with stones the children had painted in bright, joyful colors. We planted together tomatoes, beans, squash, herbs that filled the air with their fragrance. The work was hard, but it was good. The kind that left you tired in body, but light in spirit. Neighbors who had once barely nodded in passing now lingered to help, to share stories, to laugh beneath the open sky. We organized potlucks, where dishes from every culture in our community filled long tables. We held music nights where local bands played and children danced in the grass. And through it all, I felt the hollow places in my heart filling with something new. Not to replace what I had lost, that was not possible, but to build around it, to honor the love I had given by choosing to keep loving, keep giving, keep growing. One warm evening, as the sun set and painted the world in soft gold, I stood at the edge of the garden and watched as people gathered. Families, friends, strangers who had become neighbors. I thought of Samuel then, of the boy who had once run to me with arms outstretched, of the man he had become. I thought of how I had given him life twice and how he had broken my heart. But I also thought of this, that what he took from me did not define me. What I had chosen to give to this garden, to this community, to myself, that was who I was. And in that moment, I felt at peace. As summer approached, the gardens flourished beyond what any of us had hoped. The beds overflowed with green, the vines heavy with fruit. Every morning brought new blooms, new signs of life, new reasons to be grateful. What had once been barren was now vibrant, and in that transformation, I saw my own. We organized a harvest festival, a celebration not just of the food we had grown, but of the community we had built. Tables were set beneath the trees, covered in dishes made from our shared bounty, fresh salads, stews rich with vegetables, loaves of bread warm from the oven. There was music, laughter, the sound of children's feet running through the grass. As I walked among them, accepting hugs, sharing stories, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, belonging. The ache for Samuel remained, but it no longer hollowed me out. I carried him with me, but I no longer let his absence define the shape of my days. Tasha stood with me at the edge of the garden as the sun began to set. "Look at all this," she said, her voice soft with wonder. "Look what you helped grow." I smiled, tears pricking my eyes. "What we helped grow," I corrected. And as the festival continued into the night, lit by lanterns strung through the trees, I knew that I had found my place again. Not because I had erased the past, but because I had chosen to build something new in its honor. I went to bed that night with the windows open, the scent of earth and blossoms filling the air, and for the first time in years, I dreamed not of what I had lost, but of all that I had gained. Autumn arrived, and with it came the crisp air that signaled change. The garden began to slow, the leaves turned gold and red, and the harvest came to its end. But what remained was far greater than the food we had grown. What remained was the community we had tended, roots that ran deep, bonds that held strong. I found myself reflecting often during those quiet, golden evenings. I would sit on the bench beneath the old oak at the edge of the garden, watching as neighbors worked together to prepare the beds for winter, as children gathered the last of the pumpkins and squash, their laughter filling the cooling air. One day, as I stood admiring the rows of sunflowers nodding in the breeze, Tasha came to me with a letter in her hand. "It's from Samuel," she said gently. My breath caught. With trembling fingers, I opened it, bracing myself for whatever his words might bring. His handwriting was familiar, though shakier than I remembered. He wrote of regret, of choices made in desperation and shame. He wrote of seeing a story online about our garden, about the work we had done, about me. He wrote that he was trying to be better, that he hoped one day I might find it in my heart to see him again. I stood there a long time, the letter held to my chest, the garden around me quiet and still. The pain of his betrayal remained, but alongside it bloomed something new. The possibility of forgiveness, of healing, of another kind of beginning. I didn't know what would come next. But as I watched the autumn light soften the edges of the world, I knew this. Whatever seeds I chose to plant now, they would be planted with hope. The letter from Samuel weighed in my pocket for days before I found the courage to respond. I carried it with me as I worked in the garden, as I shared meals at the community center, as I walked the familiar paths of the neighborhood that had become my home again. His words echoed in my mind, words of regret, of longing, of a man who had finally come to see what his choices had cost. One crisp morning, as the first frost kissed the last of the marigolds, I sat at my kitchen table and began to write. My hand trembled at first, but soon the words came. I wrote not of the pain, he already knew what he had done, but of the life I had rebuilt, the garden that had bloomed from sorrow, the community that had lifted me up. I wrote of forgiveness, not because I had forgotten, but because I had chosen to let go of what would only weigh me down. I mailed the letter with no expectation. It was enough to have written it, to have said my piece. The days grew shorter, the garden settling into its winter sleep, but the spirit of what we had grown remained strong. Families continued to gather, to plan, to dream of the spring. The garden had become more than a patch of soil. It was a place where hope took root, where wounds could heal, where second chances could blossom. And when Samuel's reply came, a simple thank you, a promise to try, a wish for peace, I felt the final piece of my heart settle into place. I stood in the garden that evening, the cold air sharp and clean, and I whispered into the quiet, "We are all still growing." And I knew at last that I had come home to myself.